and welcome to Raising the Bar with the MBBA. I'm your co-host, Adeola Adejobi.
And I'm Jason Clark, president of the Metropolitan Black Bar Association. The MBBA is the largest association of predominantly Black attorneys in New York. Our goal is advancing the equality in the pursuit of justice, assisting with the professional development of our members, and addressing legal issues affecting New Yorkers.
The goal of Raising the Bar with the MBBA is to foster a substantive conversation about justice issues in our community and to try to identify a couple of solutions in the process.
And today we are here to talk about eliminating police brutality. So thank you both. Thanks both to our guests, to Maya as well as Phil for joining us. Phil is attorney over at Hamilton Clark LLP, and Maya is the university professor at the New School. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
You know, for far too long, it seems like Black men and women have been treated differently by our criminal justice system. And there certainly seems to have been no better example than the injustices that we've recently witnessed, whether it's in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with an officer using his knee to immobilize and choke on George Floyd, whether we're looking at Louisville, Kentucky, where we had Breonna Taylor, who was shot and killed by police while residing in her home. We have Ahmaud Arbery in Glynn County, Georgia, who was shot and killed by two assailants, one who was a former investigator and a police officer. And of course, in New York, we've had our own string of police-related Black fatalities here. Let's put it that way. And in light of all of this, and we've been seeing this for a long time, like what is it we've learned, and why does this keep happening?
I think, as we know, there are many reasons, and it starts with being rooted in a perception of Black people, of Latinos, of Native Americans, because we know that police violence is more likely for all people of color, but in particular for Black men and boys, that it's a perception. And the perception is that we're more likely to be criminal and more likely to be violent. And that means that one of the things we have not done sufficiently is enforcing the laws and the rules where it comes to police officers who violate them. Because if you want to stop bad behavior, then don't permit it. And we have not been seeing that in this country.
I mean, I jump right in there. I mean, the key is there just has not been any accountability. And I think the voices and the voices that we hear from the streets, the people that we hear in the streets, there is just an evergreen frustration about the lack of accountability. And the lack of accountability, when we look all the way back to, Trayvon Martin, when we come back to New York to, Eric Garner, when we look at this string of events that we've had, unfortunately, at least since 2012, not to say that it started there, but we can at least say that like this moment, this Black Lives Matter movement, it all kind of crystallized around Trayvon. And so if we want to just talk about this period of time, what we have just found there to be is a complete and total lack of accountability. I look even at that situation. Remember Michael Scott, the man that was running from the police officer in South Carolina, was at least at a distance of 20 to 25 yards away and got shot in the back. And what happened whenever that case went to trial? It was deadlocked. There was a juror that still was holding out. When we get back to Maya's point about police officers not being held to the correct standard legally, and then just from a moral and philosophical standpoint, just being held accountable at all. I think we just are dealing with a situation where a lot of these officers just feel like, for the most part, they won't get in trouble, definitely in a civil measure, in terms of having to pay any money out of their pocket or get in trouble with respect to their job and have any issues financially, bringing a paycheck in. They're not going to get in trouble departmentally. And then even from a criminal standpoint, they're watching it time and time again where these officers are not being held accountable for the Black lives that have been taken unnecessarily. And I think to the extent that we stay in this cycle, it literally is just going to continue to be a cycle. So I think what's happening right now is that people are literally putting their feet down in the streets and saying enough.
Right. And so with that in mind, a question that people always have is, who polices the police, right? So what are some of the systems in place that are supposed to do that now? And where are the areas that there needs to be changed? Like, where are there areas that new policies need to be created?
Yeah, and the both the good and bad news is there are many answers to that question. I mean, of course, we have the ability of the police to have their internal investigation and review process. People do file complaints directly with the police department about police misconduct. Some departments, New York City among them, has a risk management tracking tool to identify police officers they think they need to be monitoring, calling back in for training. The question is that working sufficiently? And I think because we see what we see, we have and should have very serious concerns about the fact that it may not be working fully and appropriately. You know, one of the things that is so important that advocates, and I certainly deeply believe is necessary, is transparency in police discipline. In other words, seeing what the complaints are that are being filed against police officers with the department, seeing any and every disciplinary proceeding, and seeing the outcome, and knowing for each individual officer whether or not they've got a history of complaint or not. And I just want to flag that one of the reforms that Minneapolis made, I think it was don't hold me to the year, but it was after Trayvon Martin and after Black men had been killed. I think it was after Jamar Clark. They made the decision to create an open portal that would allow anyone to put in the name of a police officer and be able to pull out that police officer's history of complaint and whether or not they were disciplined in each complaint. That is a kind of transparency that is unique. It's also new. And that is a kind of transparency we need. We also have civilian oversight, and some cities do not have civilian oversight. New York City is one of them, and I chaired the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board, and activists fought for civilian oversight. I mean, just like we see people demonstrating in the street now calling for reforms, we got in New York City, for example, not just New York City, but we were one of the first to create civilian oversight. It is imperfect, but in the past few years, we have passed charter revision to give more power to the Civilian Complaint Review Board. For example, we now have the power to investigate complaints that police lie when they are saying whether or not they did the conduct that is alleged in a complaint. That's a huge problem, you know, finding enough evidence to say that a police officer did something wrong. Sometimes you don't have enough proof of that, but you can prove that they're being untruthful about what happened. So the ability to hold them accountable for lying is really important. But the other, and I think this is important for other cities, is the ability to prosecute. We should legislate it in New York, but the civilian oversight doesn't just receive complaints and investigate them and send recommendations about discipline. In the most serious cases, in cases of excessive force, where there would be a trial inside the police department around, like we saw with Officer Pantaleo, that's because when I chaired the board, we said, we are going to send this case to the NYPD and we are going to recommend the most serious sanctions of charges. And then our prosecutors, independent prosecutors who were not on the police department payroll, tried the case against Officer Pantaleo. And I think that is important because that is a rare power in civilian oversight. But one of the reforms would be also make the administrative law judges external to the police department. Right now, they're police department employees. I'm not saying they're all unfair. That would be unfair of a thing to say. But we don't have any independence or sufficient independence in the process of judging whether or not a police officer should receive the most serious sanctions the department can give if those administrative law judges are not independent of the police department. I'll stop there, but those are a couple that are top of mind for me.
Yeah, and actually, as you're saying that, so there are a lot of ideas that I heard there. One has to do with disciplinary hearing records. One has to do with making sure that there is an independent prosecution as opposed to prosecutors within the actual district attorney's office who have to work with these officers on a day-to-day basis, reviewing these cases. And, and then I also heard a lot when it comes to civilian oversight. So let's start with the first one. So Phil, when we talk about disciplinary hearing records, the first thing I think of is Civil Rights Law 50A. And I would actually mention with that, when we're talking about Civil Rights Law 50A, the Metropolitan Black Bar Association just recently issued a letter calling for the repeal of Civil Rights Law 50A that I believe was just published in the New York Law Journal. Can you tell folks a little bit more about Civil Rights Law 50A and why that's important in this, this struggle to reduce, or rather not to reduce, but to eliminate police misconduct in our communities?
Absolutely. I mean, in sum and substance, without getting into the full text of the statute, what it basically boils down to is it's a catch-all provision that has been interpreted, some would say wrongly, by the courts, but nevertheless, it has been interpreted, and currently as it stands, it basically allows for a lot of police personnel and disciplinary records to not be made public. So when we talk about this, it's not just not made public, it literally shields these records. And so when we talk about and we hear sometimes, these stories about, well, not all police officers are bad. We have good apples, we have bad apples. The fact is, with respect to the bad apples, we can't even see what is underlying their potential bad. We can't go into the records until maybe you end up in a situation where, say for instance, me as a criminal attorney, whenever I'm in the process of getting ready to try a criminal case, then a lot of times, some of these issues that the officers have had, whether it's been intra-departmental scandals, whether it's been, findings from the CCRB, the Civilian Complaint Review Board, as Maya, previously chaired, that there have been substantiated findings of abuse, of, like she said, of lying, of just anything that can ground the understanding that we're dealing with an officer that's not good. 50A is in many respects keeping us from knowing who those officers are. And if we don't know who those officers are and specifically what they've done, then when we get back to the crux of how do we hold them accountable, we can't. Because at the end of the day, they're shielded. And it's not like these officers don't know about the existence of 50A. They do. And to the extent that you know about it, and you know that even in the event that you do have a CCRB allegation that's substantiated and you lose a little vacation time or something like that, at the end of the day, no one's really going to know about it. It's not going to necessarily affect your career path until your career path gets to a point where you felt like you have been so invincible and nothing has ever happened to you, that what happens is it leads to an Eric Garner or a George Floyd or a Philando Castile, because there's just this culture of unaccountability and nothing will ever happen until you get to these major moments that it's like, we totally could have prevented had we known this officer had the 17 or 18 prior complaints that were substantiated or that were still under investigation. I mean, when we look at Officer Chauvin, the officer who had his knee on the back of Mr. Floyd's neck and ultimately caused his death, this guy had 16 or 17 prior, complaints. And this isn't just like some anomalous incident. This is actually a part and parcel of, it seems, who his character was as a police officer.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I really appreciate the Metropolitan Black Bar for taking a public position. I think it is a critical reform for the state of New York for all those reasons. Really important.
And I was going to say, in addition to that, it seems like, for example, there were 16 incidents that were reported, but what we know is that there are probably, several, if not, potentially, at least, 20 or 30 or 40 incidents that might not have been reported because people are afraid to report because they feel like there's going to be some level of retaliation. And so as we're talking about these policies, do you have any ideas or any stances around how there can be an environment that's created where people feel comfortable reporting incidents that they have with the police?
That is such an important question, because I was going to raise that exact point as we talk about transparency, which is critical for all the reasons we've just said. And even with transparency, we will not see and identify all police misconduct for this very reason. When I was chairing the Civilian Complaint Review Board, we did two things to try to address this problem. I mean, one is we took our meetings into community. So when we had board meetings, which were public, you know, under the sunshine law of the state, but a lot of people can't come down to downtown Manhattan. So we went and what we did is we looked at our data and looked at where do we have the highest number of complaints. Often they were low-income Black communities, low-income Latino communities, South Bronx, East New York, and our commitment was also to go to every borough. So what we did is we took our meetings to those boroughs. In advance to those meetings, we invited in community leaders, meaning we didn't just physically have them in the community. We said, we want you to come participate. So we invited the leaders to come, not just put out a notice and see if they come. And we asked them if they would address specific questions about the relationship with the police department. Now, we also invited the precinct commanders, one, because we wanted them to hear, because oftentimes these were not the people directly, these were the leaders, the church leaders, the community-based organization leaders who could say, this is what our people are telling us, meaning it wasn't putting anyone individually on the spot to identify themselves, but they could say, this is what we're hearing, these are the patterns, here's what's working, here's what's not, right to the precinct commander with us sitting in the room, but also to us to better understand what was happening with complaints. But the reason that was also important is it enabled us to get the word out and to explain more directly to community what we could do about that, meaning how they could complain to us, but also ways in which what we couldn't do in terms of their anonymity, but ways in which we could make sure, including making sure that any retaliation was its own complaint. Now, that's insufficient. And one of the things we wanted to build in was victim support. I mean, this is something that prosecutors' offices have. How do you provide support for victims, like real emotional support? How do you help them through the process so they feel more protected and supported? We never got the resources to do that, but I think that will help encourage people to come forward if they get more response around what their needs are, their emotional needs, their trauma. But this also goes back to exactly why we need lawyers, you know, because sometimes people will go to a lawyer, but not go to the agency because they feel like they have a little more protection if they have a legal representative. And so I think the role that, you know, whether it's legal services, public defenders, I mean, these kinds of complaints come up. And one of the things we were trying to build relationship around oftentimes was to tell, say, might be a criminal defense attorney, trust that we can process this complaint and we will work with you so it doesn't get in the way of the defense of the complaint. We can time it out, we can do other things, so that lawyers were also helping to make sure their clients knew that if there had been police misconduct, they could still bring it to us. So all these forms of just building public education, public outreach, but also if the police themselves demonstrate that they will be more accountable to disciplining officers, people will also feel more confident coming forward.
Absolutely. You know, before coming into private practice, I was a public defender at the Bronx Defender. So everything, you know, just to build on what Maya was saying, there were clients that I used to help go through the process of the initial CCRB complaint filing, kind of walking them through that to help them feel, number one, comfortable with the process. But number two, the thing that they did have to feel comfortable with and what they would tell me, and sometimes clients who, you know, Maya didn't want to go forward with a CCRB complaint or didn't want to put in a notice of claim, you know, against the officer to file suit for the city, with the city, and actually against the city, I should say. Mm-hmm. The point is they had to feel safe. And sometimes what clients would tell me is like, look, I can put forth this CCRB complaint, or we could file this notice of claim against this officer, you know, with intent to sue him and the city. But the problem is this officer is still assigned to the precinct in which I live and which covers, you know, my area. And so it's nice that this paperwork is floating around in court, but what do I do when I see this officer tomorrow? And when he rides around the next day, and when they're coming by intimidating me or throwing me up against the wall, and there just became a point where sometimes practically and logistically, I would look at my clients and say, you know, it's not an irrational decision that you don't want to move forward in terms of trying to hold that police officer accountable.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. And I know one of the things that I know I see and a lot of us see when we talk with folks who are victims of abuse is, just not feeling safe. But what we also seem to hear is that people know that if they do something wrong, they're going to be held accountable. They break the law, someone is going to, arrest them, and they may be prosecuted, what have you. I think that one area that I think would be very helpful for us to discuss or flesh out is trying to explain to folks what the difference in standard is for police officers as opposed to just your regular everyday citizen. Can someone maybe break down a little bit about the concept of qualified immunity and why that makes it a little bit more challenging in the system we have to hold officers accountable as opposed to the standard that we have for, most citizens?
Sure. So qualified immunity it's a judicially created concept that, like, ironically was actually created by the Warren Court, which from a historic standpoint, when we're talking about, Thurgood Marshall and some of the members that made up that court, it's ironic that that's the court that came out with the concept of qualified immunity, no less in the backdrop of the civil rights movement. And basically what was happening in terms of how it kind of came about is similar to a lot of the situations that we see today. But basically what the concept says is that the courts shouldn't be second guessing the split second discretionary decisions of police officers, that they have a tough job, that it calls for on the moment spot discretionary decisions, and that with respect to those decisions, we should grant officers latitude to be able to do their job without being chilled or afraid of being sued. So it gives them a little handicap, so to speak, to kind of be able to go out. I mean, I hate to say this, but I'm going to just say it, and kind of do whatever they want for the most part, as long as it's not a violation of clearly established law. And so when we talk about clearly established law, what we talk about is maybe there was a case before where, a federal court found that an officer acted wrong doing X specific fact, right? If that's on the books and then you have another officer that comes along and does that, well, then that officer could be held accountable for violating someone's rights, because the courts would say, hey, we've already decided in a prior case that was against, that was against the law, that it violated, constitutional rights in this respect. So you shouldn't do that and you're going to be held liable. However, because all of these situations are different, when we see George Floyd as compared to Michael Scott, as compared to Eric Garner, these situations are so factually distinct at times that what happens is, for a lot of these cases, there is no precedent. There is no prior case to kind of clearly state that you violated a constitutional right of somebody. And so to the extent, if you're the first person to come up on that set of facts and the court determines, well, it actually was a violation of this man's constitutional rights that you choked him out in the middle of the street. However, we've never actually decided that before, so maybe it wasn't clear to you. Although you did violate rights, you are immune from the decision that you made. Now, the next officer that comes around and makes your stupid decision, will hold him or her liable, but you're good to go because we're providing you with this qualified immunity. And then short of that, again, you're coming out not being held accountable. And even if you are being held accountable, the other issue is, if you're found liable, if the city's found liable, but you as that specific officer are found liable for violating someone's constitutional rights, for the most part in this country, you as that officer are not going to be financially responsible for paying any judgment. The people that are going to pay the judgment on that are Adeola, Phil, Jason, and Maya as taxpayers. We're going to indemnify that officer financially via the city. And then ultimately, even if they are found liable, there's really nothing coming out of their pocket, right? They're not losing any money anyway. We've already had the discussion around 50A. So in a large sense, whatever disciplinary actions were taken upon them for the violation of constitutional rights aren't really going to come out. And so we're just back in this cycle of unaccountability.
So we only have 5 minutes left, but I would like to ask this last question because I think it's so important. Can you talk about how we can implement more racial bias training for police officers? It is very clear that the way Black people and minorities are treated by the police are very different than the majority. Can you talk about any initiatives that you know about, or if you have any suggestions on what that should look like, that would be great.
Okay, let me jump in on this, because as counsel to the mayor of New York City, the police department was initiating contracts around implicit bias training. It was one of the things that came out of the consent decree on stop and frisk and the civil rights violations of stop and frisk. It was one of, for me, it was one of the really important steps that was being taken in addition to other aspects of changing training for police. There are two things to really note here. One is, so a lot of police departments, increasingly, I should say, increasingly police departments are either looking at implicit bias training or actually, pulling in components of implicit bias training into their training modules for cadets. And for, if it's done right, and NYPD had committed to this, also retraining everyone from the top down in the police department. So not just the police on the street, but also the supervisors and the bosses who make decisions like whether to discipline someone or whether they have a problem. Here's the thing, not all implicit bias training is created equal. So question about whether it's the right kind and whether it has sufficient impact. And the second is all of this talk we've been talking about so rightly around accountability and transparency around accountability. Implicit bias training, and Phillip Goff, who Dr. Goff is the preeminent scholar on implicit bias policing and on training. But as Dr. Goff will say, unless you are monitoring the impact of the training, unless you have the policies in place that demand the right types of behaviors in policing, and unless you are measuring and taking action when they're violated, the training itself will not be enough. And so, like so many of the reforms we're talking about, we need all these pieces. So it's both the training, making it the right training, making sure the policies and practices of the department line up with the substance of that training, and then making sure it's monitored and making sure police are being held accountable to it. That's what makes it work.
Thank you so much. We are actually out of time. There's obviously so much more that we can talk about. We want to thank both of you, Phil and Maya, for joining us and providing this great information for our audience. And we will continue the conversation. And so we want to thank all of you for watching Raising the Bar with the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. See you next time.
Thank you.